Hello everyone, I am Dr. Shin Kim. I am teaching the history of Israel and almost we are at the end of the class, okay? Every actually class I start with this time period, the history of Hebrew, BC 1800 through 500 around, and BC 1100 year, BC 1100, actually Abraham left Uru, he heard the voice of God, and he followed the voice of God. And he actually passed the test, and he became the ancestor of whole Israel. And he has son Isaac and Jacob. Through the period of Jacob, actually they went to the Egypt in order to find food at the time. And almost over 400 years actually they stay in Egypt, and actually the Israel people actually lived in Egypt as a slave, and they cry out for their suffering, and finally God heard of their request, and he set up the Moses, and Moses actually led the whole Israel people out of Egypt. That story is Exodus story. And as soon as the Moses died in the desert, his actually successor called Joshua. Actually, he led the Israel, and finally they coming back to the land of Canaan. And almost 200 years actually judge one kind of leader, but they are not the kings, okay? And they lead the whole 12 tribes in Israel. And after that, Israel people actually asking, give us God, give us God. Finally, God responds to their asking and give the king. The first king is Saul, second king is David, third king is King Solomon, and only 80 years actually they has a period of a united kingdom. But unfortunately, as soon as King Solomon died, after that north and south actually divide. Actually, northern part actually called the kingdom of Israel. Actually, there is fallen by the Assyrian Empire. Actually, that's the story of the almost 10 weeks actually lecture. And today I'm gonna dealing with the history of kingdom of Judea, and finally even certain part of the Israel, they were invaded by the Babylonian Empire and they were destroyed. So it was actually BC 586, fall of Jerusalem to a Babylonian actually king called Nebuchadnezzar. It is extremely hard to pronounce. Today I'm gonna dealing with the southern part of southern actually kingdom of Judea, and finally fall of the whole actually kingdom of Israel. Unfortunately, after that they lost their nation, and they become diaspora. Diaspora means they cannot stay in Israel. All of the people actually Israel people actually they were diverse throughout the whole Europe or other country. So they totally lost their lands, and they no longer stay in the Jerusalem, and they almost more than actually 2,500 years. Just imagine that. For 2,500 years, Israel didn't have any nation. Israel didn't have any land to live. So that's the actually, but around the middle of 20th century, finally Israel built up their nation, and the modern nation of Israel was born. But until that time, actually, exactly the year of BC 586, fall of Jerusalem. Okay, the nation of Israel was disappeared from this world, this history, from this map. And almost 1950, during that actually time, Israel actually establish their new nation. So that means they are almost 2,500 years. The nation of Israel no longer exists. That's the actually sad story of the today. And maybe, yeah, from the previous class, you may look at this one, and you may see United Kingdom left upper, United Kingdom, first King Saul, second King David, third King Solomon, after that northern part, and the northern part, the kingdom of Israel, and there were 19 kings, and unfortunately all kings of Israel were bad or worse. Oh my God. Even though God actually established the nation of Israel, and God actually allowed Israel people to escape from the Egypt, they saw so many miracles done by God, and but they totally forget about their God. So unfortunately, yeah, actually through the previous class, I'm already talking about this story, sad story. 19 kings, not a single one remember the good actually history done by God. They totally worshiping other God, especially the God in Philistine called Baal. Actually, some kinds of the God who control the weather. So that's actually the end of the story. But today, as I said, I'm gonna dealing with Judah, southern part, okay? Kingdom of Judah or Judah. So even, yeah, almost there were 19 kings, okay? They exist more than 150 years longer than northern the kingdom of Israel. They only even, yeah, the year of BC 722, the northern kingdom of Israel was disappeared. Actually, Assyrian Empire occupied that area. They lost their nationality, and only alone the kingdom of Judah alone survived more than 150 more years. And also there were 19 kings. And maybe you remember that the red color, Rehoboam and Abijah, some kind of red color, they are bad, worse kings. But very fortunately, there were some good kings who remember the Creator, their God. So that king's name was colored by the actually green, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joashi, something like that. So after that, finally the year over. But unfortunately, from the 13 kings, Manasseh through the Zedekiah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kings, straight to 7 kings. They are extremely bad kings. They worshiping Baal, other god. They forget about the faith from their ancestor, and finally got punished through the Babylonian Empire. And exactly BC 586, the nation, the kingdom of Judea was destroyed. Jerusalem destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. And the end of the story of whole Israel history written in the Old Testament, unfortunately. So I don't want to deal with the full detail with each king, what did he have done. I don't want to talk about that. But just remember, the left side map is the extent of King David's kingdom, okay? And even there is Dead Sea, okay? But from the northern part, even they occupied, they attacking northern part of other nation called Aram, and actually King David was extremely excellent king, and God loves him, and King David actually extended the territory of the whole Israel. But by the time of Solomon, a little bit reduced, and finally, after the death of the King Solomon, actually it was divided by northern Israel, southern Judea, right side actually map you are looking at. And unfortunately, through the previous actually last class, actually, the green part, the kingdom of Israel was occupied by Assyrian Empire, and only extremely small part, okay? Comparing two maps, okay? you may see the Dead Sea. Small, right side it looks like big, but left side Dead Sea is small. Only extremely looks like only less than 20% of territory remained, unfortunately. Finally, that small territory called the Kingdom of Judea was also invaded by Babylonian Empire, and it actually disappeared from the history. And all were bad in the kingdom of Israel, and some were good in the kingdom of Judea. So we already see the other kings' names. Okay, 19 kings in the kingdom of Israel. All color were red. That means they are bad and worse. And they were destroyed BC 722. And now Judea, the kingdom of Judea remains. And white color, they are bad, but a little bit dark blue color, they are good kings. Okay. Yeah, very fortunately, there are some good kings in the kingdom of Judea. But that's why maybe they could survive more than the kingdom of Israel. But unfortunately, as I said, almost the end of the kingdom, several kings straightly they are extremely bad. Finally, fall of Jerusalem, fall of kingdom of Judea. And the kingdom of Judea, people of Judea, looked down on kingdom of Israel because true sacrifice had to be offered at the temple in Jerusalem. So the center, the religious center of Israel was located in the temple of God in Jerusalem. So actually, the temple of God was established by the King Solomon, and but Assyrians actually invaded that area, and as soon as they conquered the area, they married to each other, and looks like they lost their bloodline, pure bloodline as Israel nation. That's why always the kingdom of Judah, actually they despise the kingdom of Israel. And Jehoshaphat reigned, as I said, I don't want to explain all of them, okay? Jehoshaphat is one of good example as a good king. He destroyed the idol and the pagan sanctuaries. Right side, actually, this is the god of Philistine called Baal. Baal is some kind of a farming god, okay? He controlling the weather. So usually agricultural area, the weather is extremely important. Yeah, just now the state of California, we don't have enough water. So farming is extremely hard. And finally, the governor of California forbidden to use too much water. Maybe next month, we can only use per person 80 gallon of water per person maybe. And but Baal is actually the agricultural god. And Joash, actually he is also another example of a good king. He killed King Athaliah. King Athaliah, actually she was worshiper of Baal, other kings. And also Joash killed the priest of Baal, destroyed the temple of Baal. So still in the modern day there are a lot of statue or temple of Baal. So this is actually old stuff, but still survived, and we can guess. So many actually Israel people actually they worshiping Baal instead of God, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. They forget about that, and they worshiping Baal. And the kingdom of Judah alone around 150 more years. Uzziah, green color, that means he's good king. He defeated the Philistine and the Arab. Ahaz, red means he's bad kings. So as a punishment, Assyria attacked, and prophet Isaiah. Actually, Isaiah is one of a great prophet in the Old Testament. He is a huge, big prophet, and he actually urged Ahaz to trust in God. Please, back to God. God going to save you. But unfortunately, Ahaz actually he reject the worship of Yahweh, maybe in other words of creator in Israel. But unfortunately, King Ahaz actually he adopted an Assyrian type of altar. That means he accepting Assyrian god. He forget about that. So that's why Assyria attacked. So even though there are so many prophets who warning, okay, back to the Lord, back to God, back to the Creator, back to the God of Abraham, back to the God of King David, they warn, okay, they give a lot of advice. But usually one of the characteristics of bad kings, they never listen to the voice of the prophet. That's why. And another king, Hezekiah, green, that means he's a good king. He tried to throw over Assyrian control and tribute. Isaiah, another, also again, the great prophet assured the pious Hezekiah that Jerusalem would not be captured. Even strong country called the Assyrian Empire invade the kingdom of Judah, but the Isaiah actually recommend King Hezekiah, please trust in God. So finally the angel of the Lord slew many of the besieging Assyrian in the night. So instead of the Judah army, actually the angel of God murdered Assyrian army through the only one night. That kind of thing actually written in the Old Testament, okay? The Assyrian army was infested with mice and bubonic plague, some kinds of coronavirus, and Hezekiah was known for his religious reform and his return to the law of the Lord. He trusts in God. That's why even though the huge empire called Assyrian, actually they invade the kingdom of Judah, they survived because God protected them. And even the angel of the Lord, actually they fought against the invasion of the Assyrian Empire. That is only the way for actually Israel to survive. They are extremely minor country. How could they survive? Only by the protection of God. Only by the leadership of God they could survive. And wise kings actually they knew that. That's why they listen to the voice of God. But unfortunately, bad kings they rely on their power, and they were attacking by other big country. And grandfather still Manasseh Assyrian carried him a prison to Babylon. Another actually time Babylon actually invade and make arrest the King Manasseh and bring him to the Babylon. So this is actually the punishment of God because of King Manasseh's idolatry. Maybe again Manasseh actually he worshiping the god of Philistine Baal, and after Manasseh repent and return to the Lord, finally Manasseh repent. Okay, he said, I'm sinner, God, I'm sorry to worshiping other God, but now I decided to return to you. As soon as he prayed, actually God listened to his prayer, and Assyrian allowed him to return his throne in Jerusalem. Another good king called Josiah. Actually, he introduced religious reform like Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah, and remove local shrine of idols. Other gods' temple, he destroyed it. This reform were based on the book of the law found in the temple. He found the God's law, the law written in Ten Commandments. He found that in the temple, and the painting actually exactly showing that the they found the law of God and they read it and they try to follow the direction of God and centralized the public worship and the observation of Passover in Jerusalem. So Josiah, the King Josiah, actually returned to God, and he remembered as a good king. And yeah, I don't want to explain all 19 kings from the Jeroboam to Zedekiah, 19 kings. I don't want to explain all of them, but show just a very short example. Who is good king, who is bad king, and what did they do? I little bit explain about that. And but unfortunately, the future, actually the fortune of Israel depends on usually a small kingdom of Judah surrounded by so many big empire. And Egypt is a strong country, and Babylonia, there are so many big countries, they surround them. Finally, Egypt invaded kingdom of Judah, and the Egyptian conquered the kingdom of Judah in BC 620. And the king of Egypt, actually, Pharaoh of Egypt, his name is Necho, and you may see his head statue, okay? Disposed Jehoash and took him captive. He actually bring the king of Judah, bring him to actually Egypt, and Necho put his brother Eliakim, but also his bad king in his place, and gave him to the throne named Jehoiakim, but as I said, he's bad kings. So they were attacking. They are under control of the Egyptian empire, almost the end of their kingdom. And suddenly another big kingdom called Babylonian. Look at the map. Israel located between Egyptian kingdom and the Babylonian empire. Unfortunately, they looks like a bridge, located in the bridge between the Egypt actually empire, Babylonian empire. Unfortunately, two of them are extremely strong actually empire. And first of all, Egypt actually occupied the land of the kingdom of Judah, and later Babylonian empire. Actually, after Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon defeats king of Egypt in 600 BC 605, the Babylonian BC they took over Jerusalem, and Joachim became the vassal of Nebuchadnezzar. They are actually under control by the Babylon Empire. Some of Judean nobility, including Daniel, were taken to Babylon. So many people actually, the Babylonian kings actually bring so many Israel people, bring them to their one country, especially the capital city of Babylonian Empire, Babylon, okay, Babylon. They bring a lot of Israel people to Babylon as a slave. Zedekiah, actually, he is disregarding the warning of Jeremiah. Another actually great prophet called Jeremiah. Actually, Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon, relying on Egyptian help. Actually, unfortunately, he is a little bit stupid. During that time, Babylon Empire, the power of Babylonian Empire was greater than Egypt, the kingdom of Egypt. But he relied on Egypt, and he misunderstood Egypt going to help the kingdom of Judah. That's why he revolted. He fought against the Babylonian Empire, but as you know, Babylonian Empire is extremely huge. They have a strong army, and they destroyed Jerusalem. Finally, King Nebuchadnezzar, actually he is one of the great kings throughout the Babylon Empire, and there are a lot of his also stone statues. and there are a lot of picture drawing, there are a lot of painting describe his actual face, and even we see the painting. He looks like a extremely superpower, actually emperor in the kingdom of Babylonian Empire. And under the King Nebuchadnezzar, actually so many people actually they must leave Jerusalem, and they must move to the land of Babylonian Empire, especially the capital city of Babylonian Empire, Babylon. Many people must move that area. They should left there to Jerusalem. And King Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldean captured Jerusalem. BC 597 punished the Jews. Babylonian took the Jerusalem, seized the palace, and burned the temple. Unfortunately, the temple of God, actually built by King Solomon, that was burned, and the fall of Jerusalem. And Zedekiah was the king, actually almost the last king of Judea. Zedekiah was captured, blinded, and taken to the Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent more than 10,000 Jewish to Babylon, appointed a new Jewish king. And unfortunately, Jewish revolt against Chaldeans again, and finally Chaldean ruler crushed Jerusalem. That happened BC 586. The end of the story, the end of the history of the kingdom of Judea in BC 586. So they took the king and thousands of Jews to the Babylon several times. Not only one time, okay? By the several times, Israel people, they were arrested and they were moved to Babylonian Empire. So look at the painting. This is extremely sad painting called Babylonian captivity. They become the slave. Again, Israel people. Long time ago, they became slave in Egypt. Now, Israel people, they became a slave in Babylonian Empire, unfortunately. And the castle called Jerusalem, it was burned. There were fire and smoke. That's why. And among actually four sides of the King Solomon's temple, the temple of the Lord, it was a huge building, and only one side of the wall remained, but other three sides were totally destroyed, and the temple of the God was also no longer, it was just not a single stone wall remains. And every Israel people, they go to the wall, they cried because they try to remember the sad story, extremely tragic story of the whole Israel. So their descendants try to remember. They go back to this west wall and wailing, it called wailing wall because they cried and they try to remember their sad history. And the kingdom of Israel destroyed by Sargon II, by the Assyrian Empire, and the kingdom of Judah destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, actually king of Babylonian Empire. And no more story. It looks like the end of the whole history of Israel written in the Old Testament. And still there are a lot of actually record describing that Israel people actually they became a slave and they were sent to Babylon. So Israel in captivity. You may see several actually colored way, and the Assyrian actually bring so many Israel people to Assyria, and again Babylonian took Judah into captivity. Assyrian take the Gentile to fill the Israel. So that's why after the fall of Jerusalem, actually Assyrians and Babylonians, and they're living in the capital city of the Jerusalem. They live there. They live in Samaria, north capital of the kingdom of Israel, northern part, southern capital of the Judea, Jerusalem. Actually, they occupied that area. So that's why we see the diaspora. Israel people no longer live in their land, and they living in Babylon, Assyria, or some of them go to the Egypt, some of them go to the Western Europe. So, and during the colonization, now the Babylonian Empire actually ruling over the Israel, and the Israel people no longer lived in the land of their land, and they lost their nation. But during that time, still there are a lot of great prophets called Jeremiah and Daniel and Isaiah, so many good prophets, because God feared on Israel people. God still wanted to lead Israel people to the way of God. Jeremiah in writing and Ezekiel in person taught the exile, the Babylonian captivity, that the destruction of Jerusalem and exile were Yahweh, God's punishment for their sins, because they forget about their God, they worshiping idols. Daniel had risen to the position of the counselor to the king. Maybe one of the great story in the Old Testament is that one day actually Daniel was put in the den of a lion. Lions were extremely hungry, but lions didn't kill prophet Daniel, and they didn't neither eat Daniel. So the king of Babylonian Empire, he was surprised. Maybe you are under the protection of God. So he put Daniel in higher position in Babylonian Empire. The prophecy of the second part of the Isaiah actually comfort the exile with the assure that God would lead them out of Babylonia. So a little bit later, they back to their one nation, and they start building up the temple of God again. But still, BC 586, the nation of the kingdom of Judea disappeared. No, there is actually the end of the story. But even though they lost their country, God still tried to lead his one people called Israel. He never forget his people, Israel. Actually, yeah, this is actually the whole history of Israel, and your homework going to be read the Bible second king in the Old Testament, or you may watch the movie. I'm gonna send the YouTube click to you. You may watch, and one of them going to be your homework. And this is the end of today's lesson. And what do you think about it? And try to make a good thinking about, good judgment about the history of Kingdom of Judea. Okay, thank you to listen to my lecture. See you next time. Thank you.